Remember those exit polls just back in November where the border crisis, border security, illegal immigration, whatever you want to call it, it polled across the board in the exit polls as the second most pressing issue facing the country. Now, doesn't even crack the top 10. Why? Because Trump solved it.
Welcome to Restoring America, a project of the Washington Examiner. As always, please be sure to subscribe on all our social media channels and wherever you may be watching. And be sure to check out our content at washingtonexaminer.com. I'm joined today by my colleague, Tiana Lowe-Desher. Tiana, good to be with you.
Hi, Jeremiah.
100 days in, Trump administration, what do you think?
So on the economic front, it's a mixed bag. On the border crisis, remember those exit polls just back in November where the border crisis, border security, illegal immigration, whatever you want to call it, it polled across the board in the exit polls as the second most pressing issue facing the country. Now, doesn't even crack the top 10. Why? Because Trump solved it. It's over, right? You had those numbers collapse by 99.5% of illegal border crossings from February and March of 2024 to February and March of 2025. There he can claim victory. The economic data, that's the way bigger mixed bag.
Well, and before we get into that data, I think it's worth pointing out that the minute you solve a problem, people forget about it.
Exactly.
And they start focusing on the problems you haven't solved. And so tell me about the economic data. We just had a new GDP report that came out today, or Wednesday, and that was, it said that the economy contracted. Tell us about what was in that data.
It's important to caveat all of this with, this is a preliminary estimate, and in any which direction, the BEA, it's constantly going back and revising these reports. It's how you wind up with a report saying, oh, we are in a slight expansion, but actually it's a slight contraction. It usually doesn't change too much, but the point is, people expected very weak growth. Instead, we got a very weak contraction. Not great. Dig inside, and again, it's conflicting data that we see. On an annualized basis, federal government spending decreased 5% from the quarter before. That would be evidence that DOGE is actually working. And remember, government spending is a part of the GDP formula. So GDP consists of our individual consumer spending, business investments. So, here at the Washington Examiner, when we buy computers, that's business. Government, and then net exports. So you already see Peter Navarro and a lot of those guys blaming imports for this. Imports are subtracted because imports are already calculated in the other parts of the equation, right? If you import something on Amazon, that's already in the consumer expenditure pattern. So you don't want to have that double counted. We did see a lot of businesses, they stockpiled these inventories out of fear. In the same way, the data looks very similar to what people were doing in March 2020, but at a corporate level, where they had no idea what was going to happen with these tariffs. And again, the big asterisk you have to put on all this data is that it all comes before Trump made clear his Liberation Day reciprocal tariff. So no one knew what to expect.
And right, so this data is for Q1, which I believe ends March 30th, correct?
Yes,
so
yes.
Liberation Day was what, April 3rd?
Yeah,
something like that. So we didn't even have the specifics on the tariffs, but we did know that they were coming.
Yes.
But no one really knew how at that point. So can you tell us a little bit about how, you mentioned it briefly about how corporations have been stockpiling exports. Yeah. Can you give us a little more sense about why they would be doing that and how that could show up in the economic numbers going forward? And maybe, is there any silver lining for President Trump in that equation?
So you saw consumer expenditures, decelerates. You have, gross private domestic investment up 22%. But again, that could, how I was saying, imports, you don't want to double count them, and that's why you subtract it. That's because that gross private domestic investment might actually include those imports, Yes, you see that in the net export section, imports weighing down that category, but in the gross private domestic investment, that increased GDP because you had the underlying fundamentals for corporate America. Remember, they were excited for President Trump because they saw him. They saw what he did before.
Right, they were thinking they were getting term one Trump, yes, which really wasn't what happened.
No, and let's be clear. There was a lot to love from term one, and there's a lot to love that it looks like President Trump does want to replicate, right? The deregulatory agenda, drill, baby, drill, making those Tax Cuts and Jobs Acts expiring provisions permanent, that's great. But the thing with having widespread tariffs like that, if you make pencils and you need to import the erasers, right? Because I don't think we do the domestic rubber protection for the erasers. Then you would have wanted to stockpile your inventory of erasers before you have not just the 10% tariffs that are still in effect universally, in China obviously it's over 100%, but then whatever the additional reciprocal tariff would be at the end of this 90-day pause. Now, what everyone is hoping for, and you're seeing clearly in the bond market that has since rebounded since that turmoil, the stock market, which remains about down 9 to 12% since Inauguration Day, depending on which indices you're using. What they all hope is that we get free and fair trade deals with our allies, that Japan and Vietnam are honest brokers when they say, we want to do 0 tariffs with you and, make the non-tariff barriers fair, but a lot of those are more environmental protections than anything.
But I think, Trump has always focused a lot on the trade deficits. I would have to think that any deals that we get are also going to come with commitments to buy a lot more American products from these countries, right? And what would that do to the GDP?
So that would be very harmful. And remember, the reason why the bond market started spiraling out of control was not the immediate aftermath of Liberation Day. So Liberation Day was a Wednesday. You had Thursday, Friday. The stock market wiped out $7 trillion in value, but the bond market was doing okay. It wasn't until the weekend, because that's when you had CEA Chair Steve Moran saying, being the US dollar as the world reserve currency is a burden that we don't want anymore. And that's when everyone freaked out, and here's why. There are two sides of the ledger. There's the trade balance, and we have overall a deficit. We have a surplus when it comes to services, but overall, with goods and services combined, we do have a trade deficit. The other side of the ledger is your capital accounts balance. And there, we have a surplus, because if you go onto Amazon and you buy a TV from Japan, I go to the grocery store, I get my avocados from Mexico, you buy your wife a handbag from Italy, all of those US dollars that go around the world, what do people do with them? They either use them as a medium of exchange, which maintains the US dollar as the world's reserve currency, or you buy US treasuries. And US treasuries historically have been the world's safe haven. And part of why the post-Liberation Day fallout after that weekend was really weird is because usually if stocks tank, the bonds are supposed to do much better. But instead, the yields exploded, which meant the value of the bonds went down. And in part, that's because you had capital flight, which is something you really only see in emerging markets. You do not see that in the US. And that was a very scary moment. And that's why the pivot came from Trump when he said, no, we are entertaining deals. I'm the king of the deal. I know the art of the deal. I'll make a deal. And that's why everything has chilled out since then. If we did not have a trade deficit, that would mean that the money isn't flowing back into treasuries. And to put this into real terms, with, let's say, this very large and I think incipient faction of the GOP that doesn't want to cut entitlement spending, right? Donald Trump won, saying, I'm not going to cut entitlement spending. Okay, well, part of the way we're able to have as much social spending as we do, where it's like, 40% of all births are covered by Medicaid. The only reason why we're able to finance that is because the trade deficit keeps bond yields low, which allows us to have really low borrowing costs. Other countries can't have one-to-one debt to GDP or deficit to, or debt to GDP ratios, right? The only reason we can is because we can finance our debt at much lower rates than everyone else. The moment we don't have a trade surplus, that goes away.
But if Trump, so you're saying that if Trump wants to increase exports, it's actually going to be bad for the economy?
Look, if things happen organically in specific sectors, and I think they will, I think if you look at what Elon Musk is doing, he's creating the first massive amount of lithium refining in the US. And other countries, as they, embrace the green agenda, they're going to need that. So I think we will become a net exporter when for some really high level goods that require,
And the important on the lithium is that that's key to giving Trump leverage with China, because
exactly.
That's
yes.
one of the things that they kind of have the entire world, at their beck and call when it comes to exports from China. Well, Tiana, thank you so much for being here and for walking us through this. Please be sure to review anything that Tiana has written and all of our other great writers at the Washington Examiner. Until next time.